Greenland. It's the largest island in the world. Even while making up for the inaccuracy of our good pal Mercator, it's still incredibly big. Like, bigger than Alaska. And just like any chunk of North American land, the United States wanted it. Which seems kind of laughable today. Everyone seemed to have a good hoot and holler when Trump brought up buying Greenland a few years ago. But here's a question. What if we did? I'm not talking about buying it last year, though that would be funny. I'm saying, what if the US bought Greenland in the 1940s? There's multiple reasons why the US wanted this big ol' island. For one, the Monroe Doctrine. I'm not kidding, like that was the justification in the early 20th century. Mostly though, it was because of defense. Greenland was a perfect middle ground between Europe and the US, a place to station naval and military bases, and then maybe nuclear defenses, who knows. The Americans made two offers in the 20th century. The one that had the best shot was in 1946, where after occupying the island after World War II, the US offered to buy Greenland from Denmark, who promptly said, please get off our island. And then, the US just didn't. Despite not owning Greenland, the US still put a base on the island as a watchdog against the Soviets across the Arctic Circle. In any realistic sense, we should probably get it out of our minds that Denmark ever was going to sell Greenland to the Americans. So here's an idea. What if the US just took it? I know it sounds crazy. This is the 20th century. There are rules and regulations. You can't simply take land from another country anymore. So how would the US get away with it? Well, you see, there's one reason the Americans could give. One that gives them the perfect excuse to interfere with the sovereignty of another nation. Communism. Let's say that at the end of World War II, the Soviets just happened to go a bit further west than they did in our timeline. They're a tad faster than they were in our world. They're able to occupy large portions of Denmark before the Brits ever get there. And so, just like the rest of Eastern Europe, Denmark finds itself liberated from capitalist oppression, and a Soviet ally state is formed. Now, if you're arguing in the comments that it's very unlikely the Soviets could have the speed and ability to occupy Denmark before the British do, you're right. The second the West sees the Soviets are going for Denmark, they would move in too. I know this is an unrealistic possibility. Maybe at most the Brits liberate North Denmark and then the Soviets liberate South Denmark, so we have something that's pretty fitting for the Cold War. I'd say for the sake of the scenario though, let's say that the Soviets just completely take Denmark. Even if all this seems a tad absurd, I agree. It's still more realistic than the Danish ever selling Greenland to the United States. What the end of this alternate World War II does, is it gives the US the best gift of all, an excuse. The Cold War has begun, and Denmark just happens to be on the other side. The US has troops on Greenland. It's not like they can just allow this island to fall to the tyranny of the Reds. So what to do? Whether from outside influences or not, Greenland has an official election to leave the Danish realm. There is no longer a gray area. Greenland is just 100% an independent state that will rule over itself forever. And when I mean forever, I mean until the locals can be easily outpopulated by incoming Americans, who then have another election that coincidentally votes to join the United States. A classic move right out of the playbook. One that Johnny Harris would make a video about like it was the most earth-shattering news ever. What we end up with is a Greenland that wasn't taken from Denmark, but one that was liberated from a communist threat. And I'm not blaming the Americans for doing this. Any country wouldn't allow their greatest political rival to have such a good position by them. And if the Soviets had somehow taken over Denmark, they would have wanted Greenland to use against the United States too. So what we end up with is a situation where the Americans do technically steal Greenland, but they have the best possible case for why they should take it away from Denmark. Outside of World War III, there's nothing the commies can do about it. Giving Greenland back to Denmark anyway would be kind of like giving land to an illegitimate state. Because they don't have a Danish monarchy anymore. Where is the Danish monarchy? How do they fit in here? I don't really know. They either flee or they get executed. I mean, they can flee to Greenland, I guess, but I doubt the royal family would willingly rule over a frozen island of 20,000 people. In my opinion, they probably would recognize Greenland independence in return for asylum in the US. All that matters is that Greenland is America's now. It's the 1950s, and Greenland is an American territory. From World War II onwards, it's been nothing but a continuous importation of military goods and manpower. Without a foreign government to worry about, the US can now do with Greenland as it pleases, and what the US wants to do is make Greenland a military fortress. Greenland doesn't offer much yet in terms of resources, except if you like fish. But what Greenland does have is its location. In an age of ICBMs and bombers, Greenland is just a stone throws away from the heartland of Russia. And while the US wasn't undefended in the Cold War, they'd certainly feel safer dumping billions into building new bases, bringing in thousands of people, mostly military, to create brand new infrastructure for the first line of defense against the Soviets. That's kind of the mentality Cold War Greenland would have. If the US did own it, they wouldn't really use it for anything else except military. This is a land much more inhospitable than Alaska. It's basically just a glacier. Not many opportunities up here, except if you're being shipped up there. This alternate Greenland is a more populated Greenland, but it's not harder to top 50,000 people. There'd be a rift between the people who were here before and the incoming Americans, but I imagine that where the military bases would be and where the native locals would live, it's very likely that Greenland to the average American isn't really thought of that much. Its population probably never even gets big enough to where it could be a state. You're never going to see Greenland vote in a presidential election unless you're living on a military base. Officially, in propaganda and by the federal government, Greenland is seen as the front line of defense against the Soviets. Unofficially, mainly in military circles, Greenland is pretty much just a joke. It would just be the worst place to be deployed to. Months of deployment at the top of the world. You either never see the sun or you never get sleep. So for about 4 decades, Greenland just has this reputation as the job somebody has to do, but nobody wants to do it. 'Cause Soviets. But what happens when the Soviets still collapse? Well, in our timeline, American interest in Greenland disappeared entirely, at least for a little while. The sole American base on Greenland no longer had a point anymore. So imagine if the US actually owned it. Greenland's purpose just poofs out of existence. For the span of the 90s and 2000s, military equipment is just shipped away to new engagements in the Middle East. By this time, much of the local economy probably relied on these bases. You might see some news stories about how Greenland is in some tough time in this post-Cold War age. This would be the mentality up until Russia invades Crimea, and then Greenland would be back on the map, baby. Here's the thing. Greenland is probably one of the largest pieces of land where it doesn't matter who controls it. American, Danish, Greenlander, who cares? At least so far, as thanks to our planet getting a little bit more toasty, Greenland is starting to actually fit its name. And what was once only important to the US because of its geographic position will soon become important because of a lot of other things. But that hasn't happened yet. The true implications of the US taking Greenland probably wouldn't be seen until the end of the 21st century. Maybe global warming makes this land see an influx in population, thanks to its booming yet temporary resource economy. Who knows? All I know is that I could never have based this scenario off of Denmark allowing the Americans to buy Greenland. That was never an option. The only choice the US realistically ever had is if circumstances had ended up a bit different, and the Danish coincidentally joined the enemy team. Today, you'd probably never hear the end of this debate. It'd be commonly brought up in online circles across the internet. It's just one of those historical but political arguments randomly said on college campuses. The US stole Greenland. No, they didn't. Yes, they did. If this sounds familiar to any political argument you've had on the internet, you know what I'm talking about. But even to the most devoted on the internet, Greenland is still seen as one of the lesser crimes during the Cold War. In Denmark, though, the Americans taking Greenland is just never forgotten. In Cold War times, it'd be a rallying cry and propaganda, instilled into every young Danish boy and girl's head. Denmark is personally affected by American imperialism. And it'd be pretty effective propaganda because they would kind of be right. Really, even after the Cold War, the Danes probably are still salty about it. I like to imagine that in some alternate timeline, it's just this awkward sore spot between the two countries. It's kind of funny. Today, Greenland might see a slight resurgence in attention thanks to all those Putin shenanigans. But even with that, none of this is world-shattering. The Danish turning communist probably would be more dramatic, but that's not what the video is about, now is it? This was just a fun little scenario. The US owning Greenland being a side quest in the larger story of the Cold War. The only people really ever thinking about it being the poor saps that were shipped up there during the 80s, ready and waiting for the Soviets to warm them up with some nukes. Hey, grunt on the ground. You know, it sucks you're stationed on this frozen wasteland, but that's what happens when you're defending America against the Red Menace. This probably isn't the best time, but you know what also has great defenses? That's right, it's NordVPN, sponsor of today's video. If you already know what NordVPN is, that's fair. It's a virtual private network that protects your IP address when browsing the World Wide Web. But if there's one thing you might not know, it's that we can always take time out of our day to learn about cybersecurity. That's right, this integration is a lesson now. Let's talk about man-in-the-middle attacks. This is Jimmy. Jimmy is out of the house. Something catches Jimmy's eye. It's free Wi-Fi. What luck? Wrong, Jimmy. Bad luck. It's actually a ne'er-do-well using a personal device, who made his device look like a Wi-Fi router. So now anything you enter, Jimmy, like passwords or personal information, is fully seen by this trickster who goofed you. So how do we solve this? Always make sure when using free Wi-Fi that your website is secured with an HTTPS, or it has this little icon on the address page. But to always be 100% secure, use a VPN. VPNs act as that extra protection which prevents anyone from getting that information, regardless of what public Wi-Fi you choose to be on. So to help you out, NordVPN now has a special offer with a huge discount on a 2-year plan, plus 4 free additional months. Just click on the link in the description, nordvpn.com/althist. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/althist. You may not feel pretty protected up here, Private, but your digital information sure is. What's a Wi-Fi? Oh yeah, I forgot this was 1986.